So it's a privilege to be here. The combination of terms in the titling of your conference are just very stimulating. And so I'm going to unload on you a lot about what I've been committed to about the future. And it may seem like it's not terribly compatible with what you're doing now, but I believe so strongly about what is going to come about and what we need to start thinking about that I just have to take the opportunity. So, it begins with what my goal has been. That, and this is the wording here that's very appropriate. It says, as much as possible, my lifetime goal has been to boost mankind's collective capability for coping with complex, urgent problems. And this literally is what started me off in 1951. And before there were computers anywhere this side of Boston, I guess, or something like that sort. And so I went to Berkeley to graduate school. They were building a computer then. And by the time I got my PhD and left, it still wasn't working. And the reason I left Berkeley, I had assumed I would settle down and become a professor and do research, because how you could use computers interactively, etc., was the big picture I'd had. I'd been a radar technician in World War II for the Navy, and I'd seen what the electronics could do to paint pictures on a radar screen, and how the electronics could watch an operator turn cranks and push buttons. So hearing that computers could punch cards and print, I just knew that there'd be no technical problem at all for them to draw anything you want on an oscilloscope, and also to watch a human operator, so that suddenly got the image that people could start learning brand new ways in which they could externalize the symbols and use symbology in order to represent the concepts that they were dealing with in their head, and that the options for just totally different ways of actually harnessing your cognitive capabilities, your sensory capabilities, were just there. Wow, it's something to go after. But I had this interesting first experience that was to enlighten my life, I guess you could say, for some time after that. Is that I got my PhD, and I was an acting assistant professor in EE, and I was teaching courses and early courses in computers, etc., before they were ready to work with. But one Saturday at a barbecue, one of the older faculty from a different department was hearing what I was talking about, and he says, well, Doug, do you understand how a promotion is made in universities? Well, I was, a big part of the story is what a green country kid I've been all these years. It's naive about things. Well, gee, no. He says, there's something called peer review. And he says, if you don't have positive peer review, your papers aren't going to get published in journals that make a difference, and your ratings aren't going to be good. I can tell you, if you keep pointing at something like this, you'll be an acting assistant professor forever. And so I believed him. So that was the first of a whole set of experiences that have been going on through the years that were about paradigms. That if what you're trying to tell the world doesn't fit into the prevailing paradigms, it's just a really, really tough problem in trying to get people to listen. And I know I've been on the other side of that enough to know that you could say, why doesn't this guy explain it to me in terms of my world? He's trying to get me to understand it. He should explain it to me so I get it, not in his own terms of that sort. So there's just a very basic sort of a situation. So anyway, this goal has been fixed in my mind and pursued year after year, and there were some very spectacular periods in which we made a lot of headway, and then we ran into peer reviews. And for instance, in the mid-70s, when we had systems, we were hypermedia, groupware, outline processing, you were working at a different distance. You could do shared screen any place on the ARPANET, etc. And the rest of the world was talking about office automation, and that the real user is a secretary, and what you see is what you get was a big deal, etc. And you got to have it easy to learn and natural to use, not like Engelbart's system over there. And our research funding just disappeared. And so we had this marvelous system. We had to take out the rest of the world to start using it, etc., like that. But just year after year, there have been very strong lessons about that the prevailing paradigm is just extremely critical about how the world selects what it's going to see about the future and what it's going to do about the future. So we could have had, hypermedia worlds and such much sooner. You couldn't tell the personal computer people about this. It wasn't until this marvelous thing happened, the World Wide Web started expanding, and suddenly there was ways for people to get experience, and the experience shifted their paradigms, and now people are beginning to talk a lot more about it. And yet, what I want to tell you about is, it still isn't happening about what the paradigms are about what's happening and what's going to happen, what's possible, and how you can make it happen. So I'm still pointing like this. And yes, I think I'll still be an acting assistant professor. I've never made it beyond. So anyway, this was a big goal. Much as possible to boost mankind's collective capability for coping with complex urgent problems. All right, an interesting observation, that purposeful pursuit of that goal is itself a complex urgent problem. So instead of letting that defeat you, you can say, so there was in 1961. I said, if we start making headway in learning how to deal better with complex urgent problems, let's turn and apply as much of that as we can to the task of improving our capability to deal with complex urgent problems. So the better you get at getting better, the better you're going to get at getting better. How do you like that? Anyway, so there was an electronic circuit I'd learned about in the Navy called the bootstrapping circuit. Feedback into backward like that. So I started calling out a bootstrapping system. And it's there to go after in the future. It's still there. And we haven't harnessed it. So anyway, this is what I'd like to talk more about. What it is that is there to go after. And so that strategy. Okay, let's just do this bootstrapping strategy. So that's been a problem. So I set up something 10 years ago with one of my daughters called the Bootstrap Institute to say, let's raise a flag and see if we can get this going. So just as long as you keep peer review away from me, I'll be okay. And really, there have been proposals that have gone out, then we get it back and it says, other people are already doing this and they're farther ahead, which they haven't shown the light of day about what that is yet. But anyway, and every one of you is subjected to the same sort of thing, so that yet you're part of what establishes a prevailing paradigm. So it's just like you got this double responsibility of how do you help shift the paradigm so that it's more realistically attuned to what's happening and what's going to happen in the future. So let's deal with that a little bit more. So I'm getting a chance. We got some funding to run a 10-week, 3-hour-a-week colloquium that's going to be webcast starting in January, and it's just something I invite people to do, because it's just a chance to start trying to bore in depth a lot of these aspects to establish, on the one hand, the sort of prevailing opportunities and the paradigms that are there, and yet the kind of, because of the scale of what is happening and is still ahead of us, the scale of it requires new ways to thinking and working. And so I said, okay, and also you could set up a sort of a strategy to see if that's, well anyway, I'll get to this. Let's go. Anyway, this is a little just announcing what we're going to be doing there, and we just welcome people getting on, and we're sort of hoping we could sort of harness some of the response of people in there. So anyway, this paradigm issue is just very, very, very significant. So it's just true. The face of the greatest avalanche of pervasive global changes that ever faced by human society. So this technology that's emergent, it's making a lot of change, but what we don't generally realize in our world is that this is the biggest traumatic sort of perturbation in society. It's happening faster, and it's just beginning to happen really fast in such a global, pervasive nature that it's bigger in a qualitative and quantitative sense than anything any society ever had to accommodate to. And the only way I can make something that is in some way parallel.
We want to hear you better, Doug.
Oh, Oh, that's no way to get better peer review. Thank you, Larry. Anyway, the scale of change is, it's just, well, I did a study about scaling electronic components in the 50s because I was so committed to that the computer interactive use was going to be just extremely potent for us intellectually. And yet it was depending upon computers getting cheaper and faster, etc. So I did this study about dimensional scaling, and there are a lot of already lore in the physical world about how to do dimensional scaling of things. And the aircraft people already had it down so that they knew how many other things they had to change in the test cell of a wind tunnel in order that they could put a model in there and learn useful things about the model. But many things happen as devices and animals get smaller. Gravity makes much less difference to them. That all the reflexes are much quicker. That as some kind of devices get even smaller and smaller, you find that the relationship between different phenomena stop working that so well. And there are things that time constants really get much smaller, and things can heat up and cool down in very, very short order. And some of the phenomena that used to work together stop working together. And the one big thing that came out of this was the surprises that are waiting there for people who've been attuned in their sort of unthinking acceptance of the way the world they're in. They're attuned to that, and they're not oriented about what would happen if changes happen of a scale past a certain point. And it just was very clear that there were a lot of surprises in the scaling world I was looking at, and boy, a few years later that just hit me tremendously to realize that all throughout our society we've not been oriented about the scale of change. And when it's going to happen, there are going to be surprises all over. And if we don't get oriented about that scale and the surprises that are going to be there, we're going to have paradigms way out of tune with what's going to happen. So anyway, this is a very important thing. So the sense that it's a very dangerous situation for a society as complex as ours not to be aware of that and be oriented appropriately for the kind of things that you gotta look for what's going to be surprising and think through. And that isn't happening. Peer review doesn't let it happen. And and I'm not trying to be snotty about peer review. It's been a very, very effective sort of way. But we just have to realize that in the paradigm shift, we've got to get real shifts going in there. So here's one of the kind of issues that external environment is just shifting and changing very rapidly. And the kind of thing we're talking about, collective capability, that lies within our organizations and our teams and our institutions, etc. And they change by funny little stepwise motion. And they're not at all oriented for changing at the rate we're talking about here. So that's a very dangerous situation. So now that I've explained it, I'll leave it for you guys to solve it, I guess, right? So anyway, this exploding rate of change, so one of the things is that they're really going to be tough problems, and I don't think I can convey to you that whole thing, and I can just tell you about it, and you can take the words and go with them. You can think about it, but some of these problems are just going to be hugely tough and bad. You know, it's going to be happening so fast. And so big global changes and more, real problems. And on the other hand, look, opportunities. So what are you going to do about that? So one of them is boosting our capacity for effective collective action. That's one of the opportunities this technology really offers us, and that we're going to go after it. So boosting our capacity to keep improving. So that's the sort of trade-off and balance that's been driving me for a long time, and it leads to thinking about things on scales and the nature that don't fit today's paradigm. So let's go taking a look. So one of the opportunities is that of what I call boosting the collective IQ for organizations. So in that respect, the information technology world's been dumping stuff out, and in the last year or something just really taken off on electronic business, e-business, etc. Boy, big changes. But this thing about human organizations and they're becoming more effective as collective organization. And the sense that it really works it seems very appropriate to call them social organisms, and to say, look, that their action collectively sort of bespeaks of awareness, perception, understanding, purpose, etc. So he says, all right, I could deal with it like that, so what? So then collective IQ also. So how smart is a given body of people getting together? So there are many, many issues we already accept that are going to need to be dealt with collectively. And it's going to be more and more and more. And they're going to be happening faster and more complex. And so is our ability collectively to deal with things going to be adaptable so that more quickly we can do that? So this is a big problem. So evolution happens, right? So anyway, spurred on the one hand by a radically improved nervous system. So this occurred to me in the early 60s is, hey, this organism picture really is that, and the technology is like a really mutation suddenly for social organisms of a radically new nervous system. And so you say, I could make a model of an organism out there and say, hey, if I picture for any biological organism that suddenly they're mutated a really extraordinarily advanced nervous system, so what's going to happen? So he says, if it happens to a worm or a mole or something like that, do I get something that's a little smarter and a little faster? But you begin to realize, no, that all the organs and their interworking are going to be different. And the musculature and everything else is going to evolve to take advantage of the speed and reflexivity, all of that. So it's just going to evolve to be an extremely different organism. And that's what we've got here, to say, okay, these social organisms called organizations and institutions will have just a real spurt of evolution. So how do we foster the kind of evolution we'd like to see, etc.? So that's the real challenge, and part of it is what you guys are doing. And are you doing it fast enough with a picture about how much change is going to happen? So let's go on and talk about a few more of these. So anyway, the sense then of a large-scale way of thinking about how to get the evolutionary environment for organizations appropriately freed up so that they can evolve more quickly and rapidly and smart without somebody steering them. So there are a lot of interesting things about that to come about. And so anyway, the thing about every given organization, though, is it's going about its evolution. Then you realize that its ecological niche is just totally unstationary. And as the things are just changing, all the other organizations are changing. The marketplace is changing. The social structures are changing. Governments have to change. Industry, education. Education is going to be in a marvelous pressure. So he says, all right, if we can get there to thinking about how you use the technology now to do our education, if we get trapped into thinking of how we do today's kind of education, we'll just miss a big important thing. Because along with the shift in that technology comes things about for instance, the rate at which the world's knowledge is increasing. So somebody made an estimate that in 20-some years, the world's knowledge will double about every 3 months. So you look at that and says, oh, that's a scale of change, right? So if that's the case, how long is a university's education going to last somebody? Oh, not very long. Well, that means that most of the significant professional and working roles in society will have to be continuously moving in understanding and knowledge base. So that means that education no longer can just be handled for K-14 and then college and then you're on your own or maybe do some graduate work. It's got to be there continuously. So then that continuous thing is going to be, well, who's going to fill that continuous education role? If universities don't get oriented so that they do it, then they're going to be out of a job pretty soon. And another sort of thing happens is that the education is just going to be integrated right into the rest of the knowledge work that people do. So you can't do it so that the computer-supportive cooperative learning and all of that has to just fit right in with all the rest of the computer-supportive cooperative operations that they're doing. And so the whole shift about the way people view things and study things and move around in knowledge space is going to evolve very rapidly. And so you just look at it and says, okay, you have to start right from the first to start getting kids oriented to that, because they're not going to be able just to go through chunk, 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 and now I'm ready. They'll probably go out and be served, you know, in some years as you know, an apprentice, like that. So that over the years, you'll evolve with more and more seniority and understanding about complex things like that, and the roles will shift and change. So that they're just, anyway, so it's going to be an exciting world, and where are you guys going to be during that time? So then after I get through telling you what the problem is and you start solving it, then I'll applaud about peer review. So anyway, this multiple pressure that for instance, in the universities and educational system, they've got to change, but the world around them is going to be changing, so it isn't enough just for them to change in order to be able to harness the technology. They've got to change in order for the role of education that has to be a lot more dynamic and continuing all through the years. And so who's going to do it? So anyway, this whole picture about people working together then starts to be a core sort of thing. So we adopted this sort of a circular thing with the crisscrosses to say, look, there are going to be people working at different roles, and they all have to be able to interoperate across. So these lines that go back and forth say that, hey, no set of people in this collective operation can sit there isolated. They all have to be, and we used to just say, look, you got a link from here will pop you over into this world, and you have to be able to understand and read it. So we can't get isolated kinds of conventions for the way our knowledge packages are created, etc. So this leads to a whole bunch of ideas about it's got to be more general, and things are going to move faster, and it's going to be changed. So he says, okay, and it's going to be depending upon recorded knowledge, for just totally sure. And that's going to be in hypermedia form and beyond. Okay, so that you get along this sort of a thing of, okay, here's my social organism, and it's interacting with the outside world, and concurrently it's integrating, collaborating, developing, learning, reusing. And about 20 years ago, we isolated the sort of picture about these three kinds of knowledge bases that would be inside. That the intelligence collection is, okay, what's going on in the outside world we have to keep track of and know about, so our organization can take advantage of the opportunities and guard itself against the threats that are out there. And so intelligence collection is just totally important. Is this thing still working? Yeah. And then the recorded dialogue is just very, very basic to the way in which knowledge gets developed about the supportive interaction, about the different parties involved there like that. So there's just a great deal more to do about the way that recorded dialogue can be interlinked and backlink management, etc., so that some comments made 2-3 months ago that could otherwise get buried, it's there that there's processes to trace back to find out, okay, we suddenly realize there's a really basic new approach that we're going to go on, and it's a real successful idea, and backtracking on that for the attribution of where that came from will just be very, very important, because so it doesn't get lost. And the similar kind of thing goes, just you look at it and it says, well, the conventions about this peer review business and publishing in the academic world, it's just simply got to shift. So there have to be the provisions, so you publish as soon as possible, and maybe only a paragraph or half a page or this or that. And the kind of way the dialogue goes along like that, essentially the review process is continuous after that, to find out how much value that particular observation or fact or something made to the rest of the dynamics. And it may be 6 months or a year later before the swing really finds out how valuable that was. But in the current kind of ways of peer review, that would never have gotten published. It is not. But anyway, and I bumped into the very, very rigid sort of reactions from academics who tell me, you just don't understand that there's no way, that's the way the whole system works. And I try to say, well, you don't understand, the world can't move as rapidly as it's going to move and can't take advantage of dynamic knowledge development, etc., that's going to be there if it sticks to sort of old-fashioned ways in which knowledge is developed and handled. So anyway, there's just a lot there. So this whole scene, and then at any given time there has to be some kind of integration. It's sort of the equivalent of what's the textbook that comes out every so often and integrates the status of a given discipline. Well, you says, great. And that's got to start happening a lot more dynamically and purposely, and not waiting to see which professor or somebody's going to come out with it. So the process of integrating the kind of evolving knowledge states so that everybody doesn't have to go trace through all the dialogue and all of that in order to find out what's the current status. So it's like a handbook or an encyclopedia that's dynamically up to date. So that is a central challenge in how this collective intelligence is going to be able to develop and work. And at the same time, everybody involved in this, as this dynamic knowledge is shifting and growing, is going to have to be learning and staying up to date with the status of this dynamic knowledge repository. So that, to me, is just a central focus for how collectively we are going to get smarter, is a really effective dynamic knowledge repository system. And it isn't going to be that there's just one. Each one of these operating units is going to have its own dynamic knowledge repository about the things it has to know about. But at the same time, it's a party of a larger one, which also then has to be there. So they have to be doing all this concurrently. So the world's knowledge is going to be concurrently evolving with lots of pieces of it going like this, and that the requirements then upon the standards of the knowledge packages, etc., that are going to be dealt with just have to get a lot more open, and it has to get broken away from proprietary file structures, etc. And then all the functionality that's going to be evolving in there just can't be locked into proprietary software packages. So the kind of open source process or something like that is just got to have, anyway, the scale of the change and the requirements about adapting to this in this very, very important pursuit is just, it's got to be. So anyway, the real user, from the sense of what the information technology world, etc., is dealing with, the real user has to be shifting to think of it as the organization. That's where the collective understanding and knowledge is the real target. So it comes from individuals, etc., but no individual is going to be able to cope with the whole big pictures. So anyway, this free market currently for the tools and services won't work without customers that understand what they need. And today's organizations don't. So how do you get the organizations and institutions to become really proactively alert about where they're going, what they want to do? So anyway, oh, sorry about that. So anyway, so over and over again, it's this explosive change. So organizations have to become proactive in exploring the future goals in pursuit of their paths. So the school systems, as we said before, they need to say, how do we change in order to do our teaching and learning better? But also, our role in society is going to be changing, and that has to be a secondary thing that just as actively important as the other one. So we've devised this term of saying concurrent development, integration, and application of knowledge to sort of represent the set of capabilities that go along with boosting your collective IQ, if you want to have it like that. So anyway, this open hyperdocument system we mentioned about, that someplace the standards for the knowledge packages have to evolve, and they just need to just go a lot more, facilitate all the kind of things you really want to do, capture, integrate, and manage emergent heterogeneous knowledge, enhance access and maneuverability and the reutilization. It's got to be scalable, interoperable across domains, etc. And so it's just a really important thing, and it has to get broken away from being proprietary stuff. Just it'd be like saying somebody is going to own the vocabulary, and oh, it's proprietary. I'm sorry. He says, hey, wait a minute. You've got a really evolving environment that vocabulary. So what are the nouns you get for the kind of knowledge objects you're going to have in your knowledge repositories? And they're going to get much more fluid, the knowledge objects in there. And the functions you're going to apply, the verbs, etc., are going to get a lot more fluid. And they just have to evolve in an open way. There's just no way that they can be anchored to some proprietary sort of system. So that until that starts to happen, we're kind of locked away from being really, really effective. So anyway, then another thing comes about us. Okay, let's sort of trying to back away from the automation idea that just killed me back there in those days like that. So there's a list I started making. I said, well, look, basic genetic human capabilities is what we start with. And oh boy, I could think of all these neat technical things like that. See, well, here are the facilities we get and the different media we're having and tools and such. Oh boy, and all these things the engineers can do. Oh boy, you know. And I said, well, yeah, but how do they get employed? Oh, we've got a few things on another side of another list. So this was 1961 that this unfolded for me. And I said, oh, I'm looking all over for what's the name of this other system? And I assumed I would be able to knock on the door of a university and find out there was already a name for all of that. And it's not culture and it's not society. It's got a much richer sort of thing. So I just called it the human system. But to realize that any new thing that's appeared in the right-hand column would cause changes in the left-hand column as it learns to harness the tools. So you just say, boy, one of the biggest things that I've been trying to think of a scale of change was the invention of agriculture. That the huge change that made in the whole social, operational, family, etc. structure on the human system was just huge. I've tried to think of other changes that I know about in human existence that sort of also were very large changes, to just get something about saying, look, when we're getting technology over here that's going to get so much faster and cheaper and wideband, etc., than we're even looking at today, you know, within a decade or so, that the nanotechnology is just going to erupt on this right-hand side. That means it's pervasive applicability all throughout the world, and this is how it's going to change. That means we're just in for surprises, surprises, surprises in this human system side as we learn to accommodate and take advantage of it and safeguard things and adjust, etc. like that. So to me that was just a lot, you know, hey world, this augmentation thing is real. There's no capability that you or your organization has that doesn't bear upon this kind of augmentation system. Because you just take an untutored, raw human of any age, but has never had any conditioning inside a society with different kind of facilities and human system, and they'd be totally helpless. So it's learning how to operate inside of this augmentation system that gives you capability. So how effective you are, etc., and that is still got to think about motivation and skill and your own basic IQ and stuff. But anyway, that's the thing. So he says, okay, how much opportunity is there if we start thinking about it to really boost our collective IQ? And I tell you, you start looking in there and he says, oh, one of the things about a paradigm that just drove me up a wall is the WYSIWYG. See, what you see is what you're going to get. And what they meant in the 70s is what you're going to get when you print it out. And making it look exactly like a page of a book was the highest thing. Boy. And you do your editing on that, and then you print it out. And we were starting in the 60s. We were saying, oh, look, you have options. You can show all sorts of views. One of the views would just show me the first line of every paragraph. So I much quicker get an orientation. Oh, well, let's organize them hierarchically, so just show me the first two levels of the document, one line each. Oh, well, let me see only a certain content. So that you started opening up the opportunity for people to experiment with different views. And then you found you could sort things, and you found you could ask for all sorts of new change. But the WYSIWYG just clamped it down, and that's still a thing that dominates out there. And you say, God Almighty, that's like your automobiles had to operate with reins because that's the natural way to steer a vehicle. See? And so really, it's that ludicrous of that's the view we have, and scrolling instead of other kinds of jumping around, and the kinds of vocabulary you can get for the functionality of how you want to move around and operate, and so I get big lessons by watching kids on skateboards, and it says, boy, easy to learn and natural to use, huh? Do you even know how guys on skateboards operate? Unless you're young enough to have learned. And but anyway, so then I watched them one day come zooming along, and they and the skateboard jump over a foot-high curb, go up over it, and the skateboard's not tied to their feet. How do they do it? See, well, it's a very interesting thing. They had to show me about 4 times with great shows of disgust for this old fart that was... But anyway, the skateboards have this lip that go back and forth in front of the wheels. And they come along like that, and they jump off there, and their back foot stomps on that lip. And the whole thing gets anchored up like that. And the front foot stops it there, and the effort goes like that. And they're not both feet planted lightly on there and sail right on to new height. Now, you tell me about the ergonomics guy that would figure that out and tell people that that's what you could do. And so then you watch the way you drive around in traffic too, and you realize the amount of skill you have and the way you interpret the guy's actions just by a quick glimpse. Is he tracking what he should be doing, or is it a little off? Does he see you, this and that? Much more looking in the rearview mirror and judging, okay, 65 miles an hour, 3,000 pounds of stuff coming right in your tail. So I often think about the 1905 people, that if you told them that, sure, everybody's going to be driving like that, they absolutely wouldn't have believed you. In the first place, mirrors this size were for shaving, not for looking at something like that. Just the skill of doing that. So you realize that the way the technologies offer us the chance to harness our basic sensory perceptual machinery and our cognitive processes and our motor actions like that, just asking for a whole shift in that. So I'd be willing to bet you that in 10 or 15 years that what you look at now is the way you study something is likely to just change drastically. Because for one thing, look, suppose somebody found out and did some experimenting that they have something automatically parsing as it went ahead like that, and so it showed it to you in color, differentiation about the parts of speech that were there. How much quicker could you go scanning for what you want to get out of there and learn about it? I'd be willing to bet it would make a big difference. And yet that would just seem totally unacceptable today. It's not easy to learn or natural to use, like rearview mirrors, things of that sort. Okay, so anyway, there are just different ways of thinking about what the future can have, and that means different ways of how we go explore them. So anyway, then another very, very important aspect here, this augmentation system was a huge one, and then capability infrastructure is another thing in society. So that the technology revolution offers singular improvements throughout many levels and places within the tool-human augmentation system. So there's a whole infrastructure of capabilities that feed on other capabilities, etc., to give you your net capability. So an individual operates with an infrastructure, and there are going to be many changes throughout that the technology can offer, and even more within an organization. So that whole infrastructure is there. So the capability infrastructure is just an extremely important concept of that. So anyway, that's something I keep waiting to have the world talk about. Peer review, I guess. So then what's the interface we're talking about? See, so that a really, really key one is the human with your augmentation system and the interface between the tool and the human, and the total importance of the coevolution of those things. So that's what we have to work on, And the automation idea is just sort of doesn't look for that. So it's an opportunity for you guys when you're talking about changing education and the process of teaching and learning is, hey, let's look throughout that whole kind of augmentation system and see about changes. So here was another very, very interesting thing to me about thinking about the future, etc. Saying, well, if I simplify to about a tool system and a human system, and if I had some way of going through the world's societies and sort of characterizing where they fit on this chart, see? And this chart says, I can anticipate a human system maybe up to here and a tool system coming out to here. And in 20 years, it'll be even further out there. But just within that framework, how do I rate different societies? Well, let's see. Oh, there's a fairly primitive one. But as primitive as you find them, they still have sophisticated language, etc. So I start plotting them around the world, and it's a pretty magical process. I do it by peer review. See? And so you look around, and they say there's quite a distribution. And how about your organization? Well, we need to be polite to you and let you feel like your organization is up front, right? So we look at them all, and we say there's a distribution like that in the world's organizations. So how are they moving in this space? So you sort of feel like they move up to the right and getting more sophisticated harnessing of technology and utilizing of upgraded human systems. So he says, okay, now how well does this particular one show the future? How about these boundaries out here like that? Well, let's just say it's probably more like this, that our distribution is like this, but the technologies that we can anticipate are out here, and the associated changes of human systems are up here. Oh, great. So we have sort of a challenge. So our organizations have been looking with boundaries not very far out, and it's slow to move an organization anyway. So let's just say, how about the institutions of education here? And did I go dead? Technology. Physician to the service. Oh, that's it. Huh? Good.
That's it, yeah.
Let's give him a good peer review. So anyway, so you're faced with educational institutions now that suddenly the world is changing a lot, and the double thing of they could change very much the way they operate with the new kind of tool and human system combinations. Oh, and at the same time they have to realize that the rest of the world is going to be shifting, so the education's role in society is going to be shifting also. So you have to be aware of both those simultaneous transitions going through, which is something like saying, okay, what's the marketplace going to be for education in the future? And it's going to be just very continuous out there and rapid, and that starting from very, very early in life, people will start learning how to work with their symbol structures interactively online, etc., in very different ways, and the ways they'll start collaborating and learning and teaching, etc. But they have to just shift right into the ways that the rest of the world does it on a real professional basis. So you have to watch the kind of things you do in the educational world to see that they sort of merge with what the rest of the world is doing all at the same time, as well as give it the continuous thing. So then there's something else, the challenge of scale in this thing. So the rate and scale of change, and I don't know how many of you read anything about the term nanotechnology, but it's where it's the explicit pursuit of how you manufacture things with very, very much reduced scale, down till you just actually talk about moving molecules into explicit positions, and then learning to make devices and things, including making little factories that assemble they call them assemblers, that they can assemble molecules in a certain way. And one interesting thing is they can go into, the garbage and start extracting carbon molecules there and put them in the right kind of form, and you end up with diamond. And so, you can use diamond as a structural material. And that's interesting. But there are many, many surprises in there of that. And in the cases where it really is inevitable now that you're going to be able to have so much computing power. As one guy explained it to me, one way of doing it is you could hold in your hand something that has processing and memory that's equivalent to all of the computing, processing, and memory in the world today in your hands. So what's that going to be? 15 years, 20 years, or whatever. But at the rate it takes the world to get used to that, it's in 20 years is going to seem like, God, suddenly tomorrow you've got to be ready for something very different. So anyway, the scale of change has just got to be factored into our world, and that nanotechnology is for real. So, they talk about health, they talk about little creatures that you can inhale that will be smart enough to crawl all through your body and find cells that need fixing. And they say, so we'll live longer. Pretty soon they're saying, well, why would you even die? You keep your body young forever. And is that exciting? Well, who knows what the psychological problems would be if you just keep growing older or something. Who knows what the world's population problems are going to be. But those are just examples of the kind of things that are going to come about, that are going to be big, big, big shifts and changes that the complex world we need to get smarter about coping with. So anyway, some more of this stuff. So anyway, it's sort of, maybe I'll stop here. I don't want to discourage you totally, but this more like what you have to start thinking about is, hey, we've gotten used to the world down here, and all of a sudden, boom, these frontiers are way out there. And the issue is, our organizations have to start moving through here. They don't have to. We could all stay like they are now, but things are going to start changing, and you got to change to accommodate the change. And so anyway, who's going to be steering these organizations? And our world is not oriented about evolution on this scale. Organizations and institutions change, even universities. So, what's the process by which universities change? So is the process enough that it's alert about all of this to say, hey, the very way we teach and work can change? Yes. And the very way knowledge is being developed and handled throughout the world is going to be explosively changing. And we should be at the forefront of that. And at the same time we need to be, and at the same time, oh my God, how are we going to keep up? So where are the resources going to come from to sort of let universities start looking for the role that they need to play next? Or are they going to get ousted by competitive, commercial educational outfits that'll teach for money? And so, how's the research thing going to happen? That every research group in the world is going to be part of a knowledge conduit that goes right smooth out into all the rest of the world, back and forth along that conduit. It'll be a very much more dynamic sort of thing from what it is today. And it's going to be very much needing academic-like research. But academic-like research is going to need to change to fit into that world. Okay. So then one thing about it is organizations, you can't just go plunk a General Motors out there or even a Stanford University. So what's the look is somehow we have to get the best thing in America, the Western world. We talked about a frontier and had outposts out in there. So someplace we need to get special purpose teams of people that are really working in brand new ways, that really are representative of how a whole big organization is going to be able to work out there. And so there are a lot of thinking about that, but without that kind of action in there, how are bigger organizations going to have an idea about where to move in that world, etc. So this comes about the whole idea of an improvement infrastructure. So I'll keep laying on all these kind of abstractions or something, but in any kind of organization, it became quite clear about 12 years ago that saying, oh, it'd be very useful to characterize the different kinds of activity relative to improvement in an organization. So we said, let's get these three categories, A, B, and C. And the A activity was the way it operates today, all the capabilities you need to do today and operate. But if you're going to improve your capability, then you need some people have to put on a B hat. And the effort of improving the augmentation system, methods, tools, processes, etc., that change and improve the capability to do your A work. So B becomes important. Well, then if things are changing more and more rapidly, you realize you have to start improving the ability of B in its outlook, etc., and what's going on there, so that this A, B, and C became important. So it just says, okay, if we've got to get our organizations moving more rapidly, we have to start getting them more clear about their A, B, and C. What are the budgets involved in those things? Who's doing it, and where they go? And one way of characterizing, here you've got your frontier, and you says, oh, the C activity is the scout for trying to find out what's going on out there and what would be a good path to do. And the B is like the wagon train leader or something that says, I'm going to move our organization out. So those two have become much more important than they ever were today before. So you got an idea about then how the infrastructure ideas inside of society and organizations need to sort of operate. So this evolved for us that we get this idea of saying, oh, here are the different organizations, universities, what have you. And each of them has customers. They have A, B, and C. And let's assume that they're like a group of universities that they have similar capability improvement targets. Oh, let's just say one of the things we can do is do a lot of common work at the C level. So that's the idea of a lot of consortia, etc., like that. So he said, well, let's characterize that even further. Let's just get it in there so that we say, oh, let's just do this in the best way we can about collective work and put our, the most advanced eggs we can in the basket of the C people, which is how to help explore out there and move. So there are a lot of things that this reflects on that are pretty good. So we started saying, oh, then you can get even beyond that, this thing we call a networked improvement community, or NIC. Let's just say, okay, let's say that'd be a very important idea. Well, then let's move up a level and let's make a NIC whose members are NICs. So all these different groups and collections that are trying to learn how better to improve themselves and do it with NICs. So this is the idea here. So this is an improvement infrastructure idea that we've been promoting, and the possibilities of it becoming actually at national scales. So it turned out that Japan got interested enough in this, and they formed a Japanese chapter of this Bootstrap Alliance. And we're trying to point around the world to say, hey, national improvement infrastructures would be a great idea. There's a lot to learn by each other. So there are a whole bunch of strategic thinking about the ways all this could happen, and that this colloquium that we're going to be running is going to be trying to tell the story in ways that can get into detail enough and get involved people around the world. But you guys represent an improvement community. The potential for you to start using more and more of the improvement, you guys could have your own knowledge repositories, get more and more dynamic, so you could represent one. But at the same time, the things you would generate would be very useful to other. Be very useful to other NICs. So he says, great. You've got your kind of things would be producing stuff that other NICs would like, and they, on the other hand, would be doing a lot about very basic collaborative techniques, about working on scenarios of the future, about how you do intelligence gathering and collection, etc., and so on, that would benefit yours. So it says, oh, there becomes a bootstrapping idea about what you would cultivate for NICs and how they would work together to support the evolution. So anyway, I've gone a little too slowly, and my time is just about up, so I'll just sort of say it's that all this is It may seem fanciful, but to me it's just been very, very real all through the years. And one of the real things is how much potential there is for we humans to be able to harness our machinery more effectively so that we can keep up with the understanding of an ever more dynamic and critical world and society and create something that's better. And I've just been forced year after year to just say, every year sooner that the world gets the idea that we can really go after this collective smarts better, gives us a better chance for survival. And that's what keeps me staggering forth, and in spite of peer review. And anyway, so I'd invite you to tune in to this colloquium webcasting that we're going to do, and I would like it as if there are groups that could sort of participate in starting to do some of this collective infrastructure improvement. So thank you very, very much.